It was a moment that no one saw coming, a single act of pure, unfiltered hate that would change the lives of everyone involved. It all began with a routine morning in the bustling streets of a small American city. People were out running errands, grabbing their morning coffee, starting their day just like any other. But for one woman, that seemingly ordinary moment was about to spiral into a nightmare. Detective Rachel Carter had been with the department for over 15 years. She had worked her way up through the ranks, showing determination, grit, and an unwavering commitment to justice. But her path to the top had not been easy. She'd have faced countless obstacles, undercurrents of sexism, racism, and office politics. Her colleagues sometimes underestimated her, doubted her abilities, and whispered behind her back. Yet she never wavered, always pushing forward, always doing her job with honor and integrity. What nobody knew, though, was that Rachel's rise was about to culminate in a monumental moment, a change that would shake the very foundation of the police department. That morning, she was stepping into her new role as chief of police. After years of hard work, it was finally happening. But Rachel had chosen to keep it quiet, not wanting to draw attention or make a spectacle of her promotion. She wasn't the type to gloat. She preferred to let her actions speak for themselves. But as fate would have it, her promotion would become a focal point, not for her skills, but for a completely different reason. Inside the police precinct, there was an atmosphere that most outsiders would never see. A mix of camaraderie, tension, and politics ran deep, and it didn't take long for people to start whispering about the new chief. Among the staff, there were those who celebrated her promotion, realizing that it was a sign of progress. But there were others, darker, more entrenched in their own prejudices, who resented the idea of Rachel being in charge. They couldn't reconcile the notion of a woman of color stepping into a position of such power. It was this undercurrent of resentment that would soon boil over. And there was one man in particular who had no intention of respecting the new chain of command. Officer Mark Thompson had been with the force for over 20 years. He was known for his quick temper, his unrefined sense of justice, and his bigoted attitude toward anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of the world. In the precinct, he was considered a relic, old school in every sense of the word, still clinging to outdated notions of hierarchy and race. His colleagues, though they often overlooked his behavior, knew better than to cross him. On that morning, as Rachel stepped into the precinct to begin her first day in charge, she wasn't thinking about the potential challenges she would face. She was focused on the task at hand, to bring positive change, to restore the community's trust, and to ensure that the department upheld the law with integrity. But as she walked through the halls, her first encounter would set the tone for everything that was to follow. Officer Thompson, already in a foul mood, had just poured himself a steaming cup of coffee from the precinct's break room. He had heard the rumors about the new chief, but he didn't believe them. A woman in charge, and a woman of color, no less. His prejudices flared up. He didn't want to deal with what he considered an agenda, and he certainly didn't want to acknowledge that someone like Rachel could be his superior. He had always believed that leadership should come from people who looked like him, people who understood the struggles of being a cop. Rachel was a symbol of everything he didn't agree with. As she walked past the break room, Rachel caught a glimpse of Thompson leaning against the counter, his coffee cup in hand. He looked at her, his expression cold and dismissive. For a moment, they locked eyes, and she could feel the tension simmering. But she didn't let it faze her. She smiled politely and continued on her way, unaware of the storm brewing behind her. Thompson's anger, fueled by years of resentment and bigotry, took over. Without a second thought, he stormed out of the break room, coffee in hand, and made his way toward Rachel. In his mind, this wasn't just a simple confrontation. This was about showing who was in charge, who really held the power. He was going to make her regret stepping into his territory. And then, in an instant, it happened. Thompson threw the hot coffee straight into Rachel's face, the scalding liquid splashing across her skin, her eyes burning from the unexpected assault. The room fell silent, the chaos of the moment reverberating in every corner of the precinct. Rachel staggered back, disoriented, her clothes drenched, her face red and pained from the searing heat. But the worst part was the shock, the sheer disbelief that someone in her own department could act with such malice. The officers around them stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Some were horrified, others were too stunned to react. But Rachel, despite the shock and the pain, refused to let herself crumble. She wiped the coffee from her face, her heart pounding, but her eyes burning with something more than just anger, something deeper, more determined. Thompson stood there, his smug expression growing, waiting for Rachel to say something, to beg for mercy perhaps, to acknowledge that she was no longer in control. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that Rachel was not just the new chief of police. She was also a woman who had fought through every imaginable obstacle to get where she was. A woman who had endured prejudice, discrimination, and violence, not just in the world of law enforcement, but in every area of her life. And what he had just done, it was the biggest mistake he would ever make. As Rachel stood there, her vision blurred with the sting of the hot coffee, she knew this wasn't just about a personal vendetta. This wasn't just about a racist cop taking out his anger on her. This was about something much bigger, a test of power, a test of who could stand tall in the face of hatred, and whether the system, this very department, could ever truly change. But in that moment, as Rachel fought to regain her composure, she did something that nobody expected. With her hands still trembling, she reached into her bag, pulled out her badge, and held it up high. "I am Chief Carter," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "And you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The silence in the room was deafening. Thompson's face drained of color as the full realization hit him. He had just attacked the woman who now held the highest position in the department. His career, his freedom, and his future were hanging in the balance. But that was only the beginning. What happened next would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Rachel's path as chief of police would now be marked by a confrontation that would define not just her leadership, but the very future of the department. Would she be able to rise above the hatred, or would the deep-seated prejudices in the department unravel everything she worked for? You won't want to miss what happens next. Stay tuned for the next part of this incredible story. Rachel stood there, the room heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Her mind raced, but she kept her expression calm, betraying none of the turmoil beneath the surface. She could feel the sting of the coffee on her skin, the heat that was now fading into a dull throb. But it wasn't the burn of the liquid that bothered her. It was the burn of the humiliation, the blatant disrespect. Thompson had crossed a line, and she knew there was no going back. Officer Thompson, on the other hand, seemed stunned for a split second. His face twisted from smug satisfaction to something close to panic as the realization settled in. He had just assaulted the new chief of police. The silence in the room felt suffocating as Rachel's gaze locked onto him. His smugness was replaced with a flicker of uncertainty, and in that moment, the tables had turned. The room's tension grew thick, but no one moved. A few officers stood frozen, unsure whether they should step in or just keep quiet, afraid to choose sides. The power dynamics had shifted in an instant. Rachel could feel every eye on her, watching to see how she would react. The weight of the responsibility, the challenge of leading this department through deep-seated prejudice, was already beginning to settle on her shoulders. But it wasn't just about leadership now, it was about survival. She could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps behind her as other officers made their way into the break room, alerted by the commotion. Sergeant Lisa Morales, a seasoned officer known for her calm demeanor, was the first to step forward. "Rachel, are you all right?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. Her eyes flicked to Thompson, then back to Rachel, as if weighing the situation in an instant. Rachel took a slow breath, glancing at Lisa before speaking. "I'm fine, but I think Thompson needs to have a word with the chief," she said, her voice controlled but firm. She could feel the eyes of the room shift between her and Thompson, a subtle shift in allegiances already forming in the silence. She wasn't just talking about an apology. This was a test, not just for Thompson, but for everyone present. Thompson still stood motionless, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening, but his eyes betrayed him. A flash of uncertainty danced across his face, quickly masked by a grimace. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words never came. Rachel took a deliberate step closer to him, the click of her boots against the floor echoing louder than she intended. "You think throwing coffee at me is going to intimidate me?" she asked softly, her voice carrying authority. "You're wrong. I'm not here to be liked, Thompson. I'm here to do my job." For a moment, Thompson seemed to shrink under her gaze, but then his shoulders stiffened, and the arrogance returned. "You don't belong here," he muttered, barely audible, his eyes narrowing as he glared at her. Rachel's heart skipped a beat at his words, but she refused to let him see the effect it had on her. She had heard it all before. People who didn't want to acknowledge her place in this world, in this department. People who saw her as an outsider, as a threat, as something to be crushed. She knew what she was up against. She had lived with it all her life. Before she could respond, Lisa stepped in, her voice sharp and cutting through the tension. "Mark, you need to step outside. Now." Lisa's tone wasn't up for debate. "We'll handle this." Thompson looked like he was about to protest, but a glance from Lisa silenced him. The others in the room stood still, unsure of what would come next, but they all seemed to understand that whatever happened, the balance had shifted. Thompson hesitated for a beat longer, his fists still clenched, but after a long pause, he turned and stalked out of the room, muttering something under his breath. The door slammed behind him, leaving the break room in an uncomfortable quiet. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable. Rachel could feel her heart beating in her chest, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had just crossed a line, and she knew there would be consequences. But for now, the immediate threat was gone. Lisa turned to Rachel, her face full of concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked again, this time softer. Rachel nodded, wiping at her face with a napkin, trying to ignore the slight sting in her eyes. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice was quieter now. "But I think I'm going to need a minute." Lisa nodded understandingly, stepping back a little. She gave Rachel space, but lingered in the room, watching her closely. Rachel walked toward the coffee machine, almost instinctively, her mind still reeling from the interaction. She didn't want coffee, at least not right now, but the motion of pouring herself a cup felt grounding, a small semblance of control in the chaos. As the coffee dripped into the cup, she heard the distant sound of voices from down the hall. It was clear that word was spreading about what had just happened. Rachel couldn't let this moment define her. She knew there was a lot more at stake than a confrontation with Thompson. The department was rife with corruption, old-school thinking, and a culture that was resistant to change. Thompson was just a symptom of a much larger problem. He had no idea what he had just unleashed, but Rachel did. She could already feel the weight of what was to come. This wasn't just about making an example of him. It was about showing the entire department that things were changing, whether they liked it or not. The room was still quiet when Rachel finally spoke again, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of determination. "We need to talk to internal affairs," she said, her eyes meeting Lisa's. "This can't be brushed under the rug." Lisa's expression shifted, her brow furrowing as she processed Rachel's words. "You sure you want to go down that road? You know what kind of attention this could bring." "I don't care," Rachel replied, her gaze unwavering. "He crossed a line, and I won't let anyone think they can get away with this." Lisa nodded slowly, understanding the weight of Rachel's decision, but she also knew that going after Thompson, especially someone as entrenched in the department as he was, would come with consequences. There would be whispers, challenges, maybe even sabotage. But Lisa had always respected Rachel's drive and commitment, even when it wasn't popular. You're going to need support, Lisa said quietly. Not just from me, but from others who feel the same way. Rachel took a long breath, her fingers wrapped tightly around the hot coffee cup, the warmth offering a small comfort in the midst of the storm. I know, she replied, but I'm not backing down. Not now. As the morning wore on, Rachel knew this was just the beginning. The first of many battles, not just with Thompson, but with the department itself. The true test was yet to come, and as she stood there, watching the officers go about their tasks, she realized that her fight for change would be much harder than she had anticipated. But there was no turning back now. She was chief of police, and this was her department to change, one step at a time. But as she glanced at the door where Thompson had exited, she couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was just the first part of something much bigger, something much darker. Rachel had no idea what Thompson's next move would be, but she knew it wouldn't be the last time he tried to test her, and the department, for all its outward calm, had a long way to go before it would ever be what it was supposed to be. The tension in the precinct lingered long after Thompson's outburst, and Rachel could feel it in every hallway, in every corner of the building. It wasn't just the officers who had witnessed the incident. The news would spread quickly, and the community, already skeptical of the police department, would have their own reactions. There would be questions, assumptions, maybe even outrage. Rachel's promotion had already ruffled feathers, but now, after Thompson's blatant disrespect, the firestorm was inevitable. She wasn't just the new chief. She was a woman of color trying to make her mark in a male-dominated, predominantly white institution that had been resistant to change for years. If there was any doubt about how deeply entrenched the biases were, this morning's incident had erased it completely. As the day wore on, Rachel's thoughts were clouded with the weight of everything. The coffee attack wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a sign of how deeply the department's problems ran. Thompson wasn't just a rogue officer. He was a product of a system that had been allowed to fester unchecked for decades. It wasn't only his racism that worried her, but the way he seemed to have no fear of repercussions. He had believed in that moment that he could act with impunity. And that meant that the rot went much deeper than anyone realized. Rachel met with Lisa in the quiet of her new office later that afternoon. They sat across from each other, the walls around them decorated with portraits of former chiefs, most of them white men who had led the department through decades of tradition and stagnation. The weight of their legacy loomed over Rachel as she processed the events of the morning. The office, while new and shiny, felt oppressive. She had the title, but the real work was just beginning. "You're not gonna let this go, are you?" Lisa asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "No," Rachel said, shaking her head, her voice steady but resolute. "I can't. If I do, it'll just keep happening. To me, to anyone else who comes after me. This has to be addressed." Lisa leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest, and regarded Rachel with a look of both concern and respect. "You're not just dealing with Thompson, Rachel. You're dealing with a culture that's been here for years. He's a symptom of a much larger issue. You've got a lot of old-school officers who don't want to see you succeed, no matter how good you are at your job." Rachel nodded, but the weight of Lisa's words pressed down harder than she wanted to admit. She had always known that this fight would be harder than anyone realized, but there was no turning back now. Her rise to the top had been a long and difficult one, filled with compromises, sacrifices, and moments of doubt. But she had earned the position she was in, and if she backed down now, she would lose everything she had worked for. "I'm not here for a popularity contest," Rachel said, her tone firm. "I'm here to change things, and if that means taking on the whole department, so be it." Lisa gave her a long look before speaking again. "I respect that, but I just want you to think about the consequences. You go after Thompson, fine, but you know as well as I do that this won't stop with him. You're opening up a can of worms. He's not the only one who feels that way. You've got officers who are loyal to him, and they're not going to just let you push him out without a fight." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes hardening. "I'm not afraid of a fight, and if anyone has a problem with me, they can take it up with me. I'll make sure this department works for the people, not for its own comfort." The silence that followed was thick, both women understanding the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just about Thompson or even the officers who openly resented her. It was about the systemic issues embedded within the department, the culture of entitlement, the racism, the sexism, the politics that allowed corruption to thrive unchecked. And Rachel knew that dismantling that culture would take more than just a few words or a couple of disciplinary actions. It would take time, patience, strategy. As Rachel sat in her office later that day, sorting through reports and trying to regain some semblance of normalcy, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Sergeant Morales, holding a file in her hand. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her face grave. "You've got a problem, Rachel," Lisa said quietly, setting the file down on the desk. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Lisa glanced around, lowering her voice. "I ran some checks. Thompson's not just a racist, he's got connections, friends who back him up, officers who have been helping him cover up things. I'm not sure what, exactly, but there's been talk. And it's not just Thompson." Rachel's stomach tightened as she looked at the file. It wasn't just one bad apple. It was an entire network of officers, possibly even a faction, working behind the scenes to protect each other and keep things as they had always been. Rachel had heard rumors over the years, whispers of corruption and misconduct, but hearing it from Lisa, someone she trusted, made it feel real, like the dark underbelly of the department was finally coming to light. "How deep does this go?" Rachel asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but her mind was already racing. "I don't know," Lisa said, shaking her head. "But I can tell you one thing. Thompson's not just an isolated case. There's a whole group of officers who are against the changes you're trying to make. They've been undermining you from the start. It's going to get ugly." Rachel's hands clenched on the desk in front of her. She had expected resistance. She had prepared herself for the inevitable backlash. But this was different. The realization that there was a faction actively working against her, trying to sabotage her every move, made the threat feel more personal, more dangerous. "This isn't just about the precinct anymore," Rachel muttered to herself, more to work through the thought than to speak to Lisa. "If they're this entrenched, if they're this organized, then this is about the city. This is about the public trust." Lisa watched her carefully. And the people in charge. There are always people pulling the strings from higher up, Rachel. You have to be careful. Not everyone wants you to succeed. Rachel knew what she meant. The politics of law enforcement had always been complicated, but now it was becoming clear that there were forces outside of the precinct, people with their own agendas, who could turn the entire system against her if they chose to. It wasn't just Thompson and his allies she had to worry about. It was the people who held the real power, the ones who could crush her career before it ever truly started. Rachel stared at the file in front of her, her mind racing with possibilities. The fight was no longer just about making the department better. It was about survival. And if she was going to survive, she would need to play the game. Harder, smarter, and more ruthlessly than anyone expected. As Lisa left her office, closing the door quietly behind her, Rachel sank into her chair, staring at the empty walls around her. She had been prepared for the fight, but now it felt like the stakes had been raised. This wasn't just a fight for justice or equality. This was a fight for her career, for her future, and it was only just beginning. Rachel sat in her office, long after the precinct had quieted for the evening, her thoughts tangled in the mess she had found herself in. The weight of everything, Thompson's blatant defiance, the corrupt faction operating within her own department, the political games that would surely be played, pressed down on her like a vice. Every time she thought she had a grip on the situation, something new would come up, another detail or person to consider. It was all starting to feel like a battle she couldn't win, no matter how hard she fought. She glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. The office was empty, save for the occasional sound of officers working late in the back rooms. She had been poring over reports for hours, looking for any link, any connection that could give her an edge. But the more she dug, the more she realized just how deep the rot went. There were no easy answers, no shortcuts. She would have to face it head-on, piece by piece. But that was exhausting and dangerous. She could feel the trap slowly closing around her, the stakes rising with every passing minute. A knock at her door broke the silence, sharp and deliberate. Rachel looked up, her eyes bloodshot from the lack of sleep. Sergeant Lisa Morales stood in the doorway, her face tight, a look of concern etched across her features. "Can we talk?" Lisa asked, her voice low. Rachel nodded, pushing aside the pile of papers in front of her. "Come in, what's going on?" Lisa entered the room, her eyes darting briefly to the file on Rachel's desk before sitting across from her. "I've been talking to a few people," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some of the officers who are close to Thompson are getting nervous. They're starting to feel the pressure, Rachel. They know you're onto them." Rachel straightened, her pulse quickening. "What does that mean? Are they going to act?" Lisa hesitated, chewing on the inside of her lip before answering. "They've already started. Some of them are getting more bold, making moves, trying to discredit you. A few of the detectives have already started planting stories about you, questioning your leadership. Word is that the mayor's office is starting to listen." Rachel's stomach dropped. She had anticipated some backlash, but this felt different. The fact that the mayor's office was involved meant that the people in power were already positioning themselves against her. She had tried to remain neutral, to focus on her job without getting pulled into politics, but it was becoming clear that the forces at play were too strong, too well established. "I knew it was coming," Rachel muttered, running a hand over her face. "I've been too focused on the department, on Thompson. But this is bigger than I thought." Lisa nodded grimly. "Thompson might be just a pawn, Rachel. He's got powerful people backing him. This could be the beginning of something much worse. If you don't act fast, if you don't start taking down those who support him, you're going to be out of a job before you even get the chance to make a real difference." Rachel clenched her fists, the fire in her chest reigniting. She had always known that she would have to fight for everything she had, but now she realized how high the stakes really were. Her career, her credibility, and the future of the department were all on the line. And the people behind Thompson weren't just going to let her walk in and change things. She would have to tear everything down before they could tear her down. "Do you have anything concrete?" Rachel asked, her voice sharper now. "Anything that can help me get ahead of this?" Lisa looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing her words. "There's something, a lead. One of the officers in internal affairs is looking into some of the same people we are. But he's been stonewalled. I can't say for sure, but I think he's trying to gather evidence against some of the higher-ups. If he's right, this goes all the way to the top." Rachel leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who is it? What do we know?" Lisa hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "Detective Marcus Blackwell. He's been on the inside for years, but no one trusts him. They think he's got his own agenda, and honestly, I'm not sure if I trust him either. But he might be our best shot." Rachel stood up, a new resolve settling over her. "If Blackwell has something, I need to meet with him. Now." "I wouldn't," Lisa cautioned, her voice low. "The timing's all wrong, Rachel. You've got Thompson and his group already pushing back, and now Blackwell might be playing his own game. We can't risk you walking into something without knowing all the angles." But Rachel was already heading for the door. "I don't have the luxury of waiting, Lisa. I need to know what's going on. If we don't move now, we'll lose the opportunity. The longer we sit on this, the worse it'll get." Lisa didn't argue. She knew Rachel well enough to recognize when her mind was made up. "All right, but be careful. I'll keep an eye on things here. You don't have a lot of time." The two of them left the office together, moving quickly through the dimly lit hallways of the precinct. Rachel's heart was pounding in her chest, and the adrenaline coursing through her veins felt like fire. The deeper she went into this mess, the more she realized how far it had spread, how many people were involved. And yet, no matter how dangerous it became, she couldn't back down. She had made a promise to herself, to the community, to the people who had trusted her. She wasn't going to let a few corrupt officers, or even the entire system, stop her from doing what was right. As they stepped into the parking garage, the night air cool and heavy with tension, Rachel glanced over at Lisa. "I'll be careful, but we don't have time to waste." Lisa gave her a nod of encouragement. "Just watch your back." Rachel's phone buzzed in her pocket, a message that made her freeze. It was from an unknown number, the message brief and cryptic. "We know what you're doing. Don't make this harder than it has to be." A chill ran down her spine. The message confirmed what she had been fearing all along. Someone was watching her, tracking her every move. And now the game had escalated. There was no turning back. Her pulse quickened as she slid into the car, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. She wasn't just fighting for her job anymore. She was fighting for her life. "Let's go," Rachel said, her voice steady, but the storm inside her was only just beginning to break. Rachel's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she drove through the streets, the city's skyline fading behind her in rearview mirror. Her mind raced, the cryptic message still burning in her thoughts. "We know what you're doing. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The weight of it settled like a stone in her stomach, cold and heavy. She had always known she'd face resistance. Every step of her career had been an uphill battle. But this felt different. Someone was watching, someone who knew exactly what she was trying to uncover, and they weren't going to let her do it without a fight. But who, and how far would they go? Lisa sat beside her, silent, her eyes scanning the streetlights as they passed. Rachel could feel a tension between them, both of them knowing this wasn't just about gathering intel anymore. This had become personal. As Rachel approached the building where she was supposed to meet Detective Marcus Blackwell, the nagging feeling in her chest only deepened. It wasn't just the message, it was the timing. Why would Blackwell contact her now, when things were getting so dangerous? And why had Lisa sounded so uncertain about him? When she turned into the parking garage, her headlights briefly illuminating the entrance before the darkness swallowed them, Rachel saw Blackwell's car parked near the back. He wasn't in sight, though, and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. She parked and turned off the engine, the silence in the car thick as both of them hesitated before getting out. "This doesn't feel right," Lisa muttered, her gaze flicking nervously to the shadows around them. Rachel didn't answer. She was already stepping out of the car, every instinct telling her to proceed with caution. They made their way toward the elevator, but before they could reach it, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. Rachel froze, her body tense, ready for whatever came next. "Looking for someone?" the voice asked. It was Blackwell, but something was off. He didn't look like himself. His usually neat, professional appearance was disheveled, his eyes wide with a nervous energy that didn't belong to a seasoned detective. There was a flicker of something dark in his gaze, something that didn't add up. "Detective Blackwell," Rachel said, trying to mask the surprise in her voice. "You said you had information." He didn't respond immediately, his gaze darting back to the shadows behind him, as though he was watching for someone, or something. "I do," he said, his voice low, almost too quiet to hear. "But we're not safe here. You need to come with me, now." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She knew the risks of rushing into a meeting like this, especially when things were already as volatile as they were. She exchanged a glance with Lisa, who looked just as uneasy, but Rachel knew she couldn't back down now. "Tell me what's going on," Rachel pressed, her voice sharp. Blackwell's eyes flicked around again, and his hand shook slightly as he reached into his coat pocket. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice dropped even further. "You think you're the one in control, but you're not. You've been playing right into their hands." Rachel's mind raced. Who was he talking about? Was this a setup? Had someone tipped off Blackwell, or was he part of the game she hadn't seen? Before she could respond, Blackwell's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. "Get in the car," he insisted, his voice almost frantic now. "If we don't move, they'll find us." Rachel yanked her arm back, eyes narrowed, a chill spreading through her veins. This wasn't just a concerned officer, it was someone who was scared, someone who was trying to pull her into something bigger, something dangerous. And the fact that he knew they were coming made her think this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had tipped him off about her meeting. Someone knew her every move. Her instincts screamed at her to back away, but there was too much at stake. Blackwell had been involved in internal affairs, and if he was telling the truth, he could be the key to unraveling everything. "What do you know about Thompson? About the officers protecting him?" Rachel demanded, not breaking eye contact. She couldn't afford to be led into a trap. Blackwell hesitated, his eyes flickering as if he was debating something internally. "Thompson isn't just an officer," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's the one holding everything together. He's the point man for a network that goes way beyond the department. And they've been watching you, your every move. They knew the moment you started digging. They were just waiting for you to get close enough." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about power within the precinct. This was bigger, much bigger. Whoever was behind Thompson, whatever network he was part of, had ties to people who were willing to go to any length to protect him. And now they had. Their sights set on her. They were using her own investigation to tighten the noose. But just as the pieces began to fall into place, a sharp sound cut through the air, like the distant crack of gunfire. Rachel's head snapped around, her pulse instantly spiking. "Get down," Blackwell shouted, diving to the ground and dragging Rachel and Lisa with him. They hit the concrete floor hard, the sound of more gunfire echoing in the garage, too close for comfort. The chaos erupted all at once, and Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the world around her seemed to slow. The gunfire wasn't random, it was deliberate. Someone had ambushed them, and the shots weren't just a warning, they were a message. Stay out of it. Stop digging. Or else. Rachel's mind raced, trying to process everything. Who had fired the shots? Was it Thompson's people? Or was it someone even higher up? As Blackwell crawled toward her, his face pale and panicked, Rachel realized that her fight had just escalated into something far more dangerous. The people she was trying to expose weren't just looking to sabotage her career, they were willing to kill to keep their secrets hidden. Blackwell grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the nearest exit. "We need to get out of here, now, they're coming." Rachel's mind was still reeling, trying to piece together what was happening. She had known things were bad, but this was more than just a corrupt department. This was an organized network of people who would stop at nothing to keep their control. And now, they were out for her too. As they sprinted through the parking garage, shots still ringing out behind them, Rachel couldn't help but feel the weight of the truth settling in. There was no way she could trust anyone now. Not Blackwell, not her own officers. She was in this alone. And as they reached the exit, with the sounds of pursuit growing closer, Rachel knew that the clock was ticking. If she didn't figure out who was behind all of this, and fast, she might not make it out of this fight alive. The echo of gunfire still rang in Rachel's ears as she and Lisa followed Blackwell through the labyrinth of corridors in the underground garage. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder, and Rachel could feel the cold sweat on the back of her neck, the adrenaline sharp in her veins. They had no time to waste. Every moment counted. They reached the stairwell, but just as Blackwell opened the door, a figure stepped out in front of them, blocking their escape. It was too dark to see the person clearly, but the shape was unmistakable. A large man, his silhouette menacing against the faint light of the stairwell. "Going somewhere?" the man asked, his voice a low growl. Rachel's heart dropped. She recognized the voice. Thompson. His figure emerged from the shadows, his uniform slightly disheveled, his face twisted into a sneer. Behind him, 2 more officers appeared, guns drawn, their expressions cold and determined. Rachel's pulse raced. She knew there was no way they could fight their way out of this, but she wasn't going to give up without a fight. "Thompson," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "You don't know what you're involved in. Let us go, and we can talk about this." Thompson chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "Talk? There's nothing to talk about, Chief. This was always going to happen. You should have known better than to try and take us down." Rachel's mind raced as she processed the situation. This wasn't just about Thompson anymore. It never had been. He was just the enforcer, the pawn in a much larger game. The people pulling the strings were much more dangerous than he was. People with real power, people who had been watching her every move, setting the pieces in place for this exact moment. Blackwell stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached for his gun. "You don't want to do this, Thompson," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's bigger than you think." Thompson's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, there was something like doubt in his expression. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. "You should have stayed out of it, Marcus. All of you." Before Rachel could react, the sound of tires screeching filled the air, and a black SUV barreled into the garage, coming to a screeching halt in front of the stairwell. The doors flew open, and 2 more figures emerged, their faces hidden by dark sunglasses. They were too well-dressed to be just regular officers. These were people who had power, real power. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the situation had just escalated beyond anything she had prepared for. Out of the shadows stepped a woman, her expression cool and controlled. She was dressed in a sharp suit, her hair pulled back tightly, and there was an air of authority about her that made Rachel's stomach drop. "Detective Thompson," the woman said, her voice smooth but commanding. "You've done well, but it's time to finish this." Thompson, for the first time, looked uncertain, glancing at the woman as if awaiting orders. But Rachel could see the fear in his eyes, the recognition that he was no longer in control. This was someone much bigger than him, someone whose influence extended far beyond the precinct. And Rachel knew right then that she was dealing with something far worse than a few rogue officers. "Who are you?" Rachel demanded, her voice cutting through the tension. "What is this about?" The woman smiled, but it was a cold, calculating smile. "You're asking the wrong question, Chief. The real question is, who do you think you've been fighting all along?" Rachel's mind spun as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The woman wasn't just some high-ranking official. She was part of the web of power that had been manipulating everything: the corruption, the secrecy, the dangerous network that had infiltrated the department, the city. And now, Rachel was standing at the center of it, trapped in a game that had been set in motion long before she even became chief. "Let me guess," Rachel said, her voice thick with disbelief. "You've been behind everything. You're the one who's been orchestrating this. The mayor's office, the corruption in the department, the threats. This was all part of your plan." The woman didn't flinch. "Exactly. You were never meant to succeed, Chief. You were never meant to get this far. But you got too close. And now you're a liability." Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his grip on his gun tightening. The other officers with him exchanged wary glances, unsure of what was going on. Rachel realized that even Thompson and his men weren't fully in the loop. They were just following orders, pawns in a much larger scheme. The woman wasn't just part of the department, she was connected to a network of power that reached beyond the precinct, beyond the city. Before Rachel could respond, a gunshot rang out, sharp and sudden, echoing in the tight space of the garage. She ducked instinctively, her heart racing, But as the smoke cleared, she saw Blackwell fall to the ground, clutching his side. "No," Rachel shouted, rushing to his side, but Blackwell was already fading, his breathing shallow. "Who shot him?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. The woman smiled again, her eyes glinting with something that resembled amusement. "That would be me. Marcus was always too sentimental for his own good, and now he's out of the way." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she knelt beside Blackwell, trying to stop the bleeding. "You won't get away with this," she said, her voice full of defiance. "The truth will come out." The woman's smile faded, her eyes hardening. "The truth? Oh, Rachel, there is no truth. Not anymore. You're too late. The game has already been won." Rachel's mind was spinning as she tried to process everything: the corruption, the manipulation, the power behind the scenes. But there was one thing she knew for certain: she wasn't going down without a fight. Not now. Not after everything she had fought for. Suddenly, without warning, there was another sound, this one sharper than the rest, a high-pitched whine that grew louder and louder. Rachel looked up just in time to see a small drone buzz into the air above them, a camera mounted on its underside, its red light blinking as it hovered, capturing every moment. It wasn't just an ambush, it was all being recorded. The woman and Thompson weren't just protecting their secrets, they were broadcasting them, making sure that Rachel's failure would be seen by everyone, everywhere. Rachel locked eyes with the woman, her mind racing, trying to come up with some kind of escape. There was no way out, no backup. The truth was in the hands of the people who controlled everything. But in that moment, a thought flashed through her mind. A way out, a last-ditch effort to flip the narrative, to take control of the story for once. "Go ahead," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Show the world. Let them see what you've been doing. But know this, you won't keep me quiet forever." The woman's eyes narrowed, her lips curling in a smile of superiority. "You think you can change anything? You think anyone will believe you?" Rachel didn't respond, she couldn't. But she had something they didn't, the one thing they had underestimated: the truth. And as the drone whirred above her, Rachel made a decision, one final move that would change everything. She grabbed the gun from Blackwell's hand and turned it on the woman, her voice low but deadly. "This ends now." Just as she pulled the trigger, the world around her seemed to stop. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the parking garage, sharp and final. The woman's smug expression faltered for just a second as she staggered back, her hands instinctively clutching. Her chest. Blood pooled beneath her fingers, staining her crisp suit a deep red. Her eyes widened, then narrowed again, a mixture of surprise and fury crossing her face as she crumpled to the ground. Rachel stood there, the weight of the weapon heavy in her hands, her heart pounding, but her mind clear. The world around her seemed to freeze as the woman collapsed, the drone hovering eerily above them, recording every moment. It wasn't a victory, it wasn't the end of the war, but in that brief moment, it felt like the world had shifted. Behind her, Lisa screamed for help, but Rachel didn't turn. She couldn't. She was too focused on what had just happened. The woman, the mastermind behind everything, the corruption, the manipulation, was down. And with her, the facade of power that had kept the city in its grip for so long was starting to crumble. Thompson, still holding his gun but now looking utterly lost, glanced down at the woman's lifeless body. He seemed to snap out of the trance he'd been in, his eyes flicking to Rachel with a mix of fear and anger. "What did you do?" he snarled, his hand shaking. Rachel didn't answer. She wasn't sure what she could say. He was a small piece in a much larger puzzle, and his time was up. She had no illusions about justice or redemption now. This was a war, and people like Thompson never learned the cost until it was too late. Lisa moved quickly to her side, checking Blackwell, who was still unconscious but alive, his breath shallow. The drone above them hummed, and Rachel knew it wasn't just a recording device. It was a beacon, broadcasting everything. This would be the evidence she needed to expose the system, the truth about the corruption that had infiltrated every level of the department, the city government, even the police force itself. They could never silence her now, not with this kind of evidence. Before Rachel could move toward the woman to check for anything more, Thompson made a final desperate move. He longed for her, but before he could reach her, Blackwell stirred. His eyes flickered open just in time to grab Thompson by the arm, yanking him back. "You're not going anywhere," Blackwell said hoarsely, his voice full of gravel. Rachel watched the two men for a moment, her mind racing. Blackwell, despite his earlier mistakes and involvement in the corruption, was a survivor, and in that moment he was more useful to her than Thompson ever had been. Thompson struggled in Blackwell's grasp, trying to free himself, but Blackwell held firm. The drone above them was still capturing every second, and Rachel knew it wouldn't take long for the authorities to arrive. "You're finished, Thompson," Rachel said calmly, her voice betraying none of the fear she'd have felt earlier. "This isn't just about you anymore. You're a part of something much bigger, and it's over." Thompson shot her a venomous look, but there was no defiance in his eyes anymore, just the cold, calculating resignation of a man who realized too late that he had lost. As police sirens wailed in the distance, Rachel stood over the woman's body. She'd taken down the leader, but there were more like her, more at the top pulling strings she hadn't yet uncovered. This wasn't over. But this was a beginning. A crack in the system, wide enough for her to exploit, wide enough for her to make sure it would never work the same way again. It wasn't just about the corruption in her department anymore. It was about the whole city, the entire network of powerful figures who had built their empires on the suffering of others. And Rachel was done letting them get away with it. She had seen the layers of control, the way the system kept the truth hidden beneath layers of lies, deceit, and intimidation. It was time for all of it to come to light. As the police arrived and secured the scene, Rachel turned to Lisa. "We need to take this to the press. Now, no more waiting." Lisa nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We can't let them spin this. We can't let them bury it. Not again." Rachel glanced at Blackwell, who was now leaning against the wall, his face pale and covered in sweat. He had risked everything to bring her this far, but she couldn't afford to trust him completely, not yet. "We'll get you medical attention," Rachel said, but her eyes didn't leave him. "But don't think for 1 second that I'm done with you. You're just as much a part of this as they were." Blackwell didn't argue. He simply nodded, the weight of his actions settling on his shoulders. Rachel took a deep breath, standing taller, letting the full gravity of the moment wash over her. She had been brought to the brink, pushed to places she never thought she'd go. But this was the cost of truth. It was a price she had to pay to reclaim the department, to reclaim her city. As the authorities took Thompson into custody and began processing the scene, Rachel knew the story wouldn't end here. This was only the first chapter. The corruption ran deep, and it was going to take more than just her to root it out. She would need allies, real allies who weren't afraid to stand with her when the truth became too dangerous to expose. For now, she had made the first step. She had struck a blow against those who thought they were untouchable. But the real fight was still ahead of her. The system wasn't going to change overnight. She wasn't going to change overnight. But she was done being afraid of it, done hiding from the truth. As the police started to secure the scene, Rachel turned away from the chaos and headed for the exit. Her work wasn't done yet. There were still files to sift through, more names to uncover, more powerful figures to expose. But Rachel didn't feel the same weight of fear she had before. She felt something else now, something sharper. Hope. She wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long while, She felt like she was on the right side of this fight, the fight for truth, the fight for justice, the fight to take her city back. And no matter what, she wasn't going to stop, not until the job was done.